everybody. Welcome back to Lights of Recovery. I'm your host, Jess, and I'm so excited to be back and coming back with a really exciting episode. I mean, I say that every time, honestly. But this time we're going to be talking to an author, a federal judge, and a woman in recovery, Mary Beth O'Connor. And she has a book that she sent me that I really loved, and this is not, listen, she's not paying me anything. I genuinely loved this book, and I think it is so important to talk about. So with all of that said, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you. And just for clarity, retired judge, right? Which is really,
Oh, yes.
and that's good because that's what allows me to talk openly about my whole story for the first time and to sort of be of service in a new way. But yes, retired judge.
That's fair. Yes, great point. So before we get into it, I mean, is there anything in particular that you like to kind of launch off with? Because I see that you've done a lot of talks and interviews, and I mean, you are such a hardcore recovery advocate. I'm just so excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in talking about whatever's going to be useful to your audience or of interest, because that's really the goal, right? I mean, at this point, it's really for me about trying to be of service to my community, trying to help reduce stigma. Like, for example, owning up to the fact that I wasn't just a drug user. I shot methamphetamine for many, many years. And I emphasize that as a way to sort of show that no matter where you are, no matter how sort of deep and miserable your addiction, your substance use disorder, there's a way out, right? But I also do like to talk about why. Why were drugs so attractive to me? I mean, I was shooting meth at 17. Why did that happen? And that to me is related to the trauma history, which, is just unfortunately all too common. And that led to mental health conditions I didn't even know I had. I had PTSD and I didn't know it. I had severe anxiety. And then, of course, the recovery side, like what's recovery really like, And so those are sort of the areas I try to cover in my book and sort of the emphases for me at this point.
Well, I will say I absolutely got that vibe from your book, because I mean, even in the title, it's one woman's
Yes.
triumph over trauma and addiction. And I don't know if I've said it on the show before, but I've certainly said it in conversation. Show me an addict and I will show you trauma. And it's, a lot of people talk about how trauma is often the gateway. It's not necessarily like, oh, because they smoked weed or drank or whatever, which does increase potential, but it's the trauma that is so often linked to, substance use disorder, etc.
Yes. Yes. I mean, look, the reality is that most people use substances in moderation, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're sort of compelled to use them excessively, use them in a way that's to your own detriment in the long run, right? I mean, there's usually something underneath that. Although I will say that part of it is that in the beginning, the substances seem to work. Like when you're in a lot of pain and you're really unhappy and miserable in the beginning, the substances sort of can tamp down that agony. They can make you actually, release all those endorphins and all that dopamine, and you feel good for the first time. Maybe I felt better than I ever remembered feeling the first time I snorted meth. Like that was the best feeling I could remember in my entire life. And so it is that, that compelling need underneath is what usually leads to the excess. But you are right. There are also other factors, like the earlier you start using substances, the more likely you are to develop an addiction and those kind of things. But trauma also, it impacts your brain development, right?
Yep.
And that's part of it. And then you throw substances in, and that also impacts your brain development. And so it becomes often this sort of loop that feeds itself.
Yeah. And, a lot of people don't realize your brain doesn't even finish developing until you're 25.
Yes.
You have your frontal lobe, which is where you a lot of decision making. People like myself with ADHD, we have typically an underdeveloped frontal lobe, which doesn't mean we're not smart or anything else. It just means our brains don't manage, dopamine and things the way it's supposed to. And so it makes getting that dopamine from outside sources so much more attractive to us and easy to fall into these traps.
You talked about how the brain isn't fully developed until 25, but the good news is the brain can continue to change,
Yes.
throughout your life. And the reason I say that is because we hear a lot about how addiction, alters the brain, but the reality is that recovery changes your brain too, right? And so, that neuroplasticity is still there. And so when it's one reason why sobriety gets easier over time, because as you sort of implement new habits, new ways of life, new behaviors, and you do them over and over and over again, that changes your brain in a positive direction. And that's why maintaining your sobriety commitment gets easier. You have more practice, you have more experience, and you just have built-in better behaviors that you've learned and practiced over the years. And so I never want anyone to think that it's at 25 it stops growth, and I know that's
Right.
not what you meant. But the positive is that your brain gets rewired from recovery, just like the drugs rewired your brain when you first started using to excess.
And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize on both. And I'm so glad you brought that up and that you touched on it in your book, specifically the neuroplasticity. I've been in therapy pretty much my entire life. I'm 38. And so I have a lot of appreciation for that process, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy. And I write
Yes.
about it for the website all the time. And, it comes up on almost every page that we do to deal with addiction because it is so helpful in helping you again rewire your brain in a positive way. And like I don't want to make it sound like Mary Beth and I are like, do drugs, your brain will fix itself. Like, no, that's not what we're saying. But if you are in the depths of despair and you feel like, well, it's too late, I've lost everything. I really empathized with parts where you talked about just being so overwhelmed with, oh no, look how much I've lost. Look at what I've missed out on. And that's not just necessarily from addiction too. I've even experienced that, in conversation about trauma. Like, look at what, I was robbed of because of my, childhood trauma or young adult trauma. And it can be so easy to fall into that trap and feel like, what's the point? I am already in this pit of despair. And it does get easier, and it's so hard to explain until I think you've been through it, in a sense.
Yeah.
And now I don't know if you have seen other episodes. If not, totally fine. I mention it for each show really anyway. One of my issues is in 2020, the January 1st. That was a shitty year for everyone, but for me, the world came to an end on January 1st because my grandmother died, and she was
Oh.
my favorite person in the world. And so as the world kind of crumbled around me and I sort of lost, like so many of us did, we lost our ability to be around people. And I'll come back to that because that's just so important. But we all kind of, gallows humor joked about 2020 and the COVID, everything just felt awful. And so tale as old as time, I drank my way through 2020 and 2021. And prior to that, I was a social drinker, maybe a little problematic behavior, but it just, like you said, it worked. It seemed okay at the time. It was socially acceptable because, it seemed like everybody was doing it. Everyone, you have a stressful day at work, go home and have a glass of wine. Like, I've earned it, this whole attitude. We're just at home, we're not doing anything, let's just drink. And it kind of turned, for me, for the first time I had experienced that compulsive, I didn't want to keep drinking, but you do. It's so hard to explain until you have experienced that, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and you're not alone in that. I mean, there was a significant uptick in alcohol intake, in particular, all drugs, but especially in alcohol, and especially in women. And now the ripples are showing. There's actually a really significant uptick in women having kidney and liver problems in their 20s. Like, there's never been this level of kidney disease among young women as there is now, and it's really post-COVID drinking ripple, because alcohol is harder on women's bodies bodies than it is on men's bodies, right? And we tend to dismiss alcohol. Like people say, oh, I never had a drug and I never did drugs. And I say, well, did you ever drink? Like, alcohol is just a liquid legal drug, right? It is vicious on the body. It still takes more Americans down than all the other drugs combined. More people still die of alcohol, even with the overdose epidemic. And it can really creep up on you because it is socially acceptable. And sometimes we have a sort of a manageable behavior, and then something changes, like you were in great pain. And then on top of which you're sort of disconnected from your social network in a new way. It was not a good combination for you or for a lot of other women. And it's important to notice the new pattern and to get it, under control. But like you say, it can sneak up on you. Sometimes for me, it was really like from the beginning, I was racing towards it, right? But for other people, it can be more of a gradual progression. And then one day you realize, oh, actually, I'm using alcohol in a very different way than I was 6 months ago or a year ago. And it's starting to have negative consequences.
Right. And then the fear of quitting or the struggle with quitting, was really difficult. And I think it's important to talk about all types, because there are people that, will take drugs, like you said, for yourself. You ran towards it. You were looking for that thrill, that escape, that, something that mirrored and reflected your own life's chaos. And it was just kind of throwing yourself into this continued spiral, I guess. And for others, it's like myself, where you have a habit that just, it turns on you. And one day it suddenly is a problem. And, people have this mentality of like what they picture the junkie or the addict to be. And it's so much more broad than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in my 30 years of sobriety, a lot of the way that we think about substance use and substance use disorder has changed. And one of them is the recognition today that substance use disorder is on a spectrum. First of all, it's a mental health condition, right? It's in the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use, but it's also on a spectrum. It can be mild, moderate, or severe, just like all mental health conditions can be mild, moderate, or severe. Anxiety can be mild, moderate, or severe.
And it can fluctuate. It can also fluctuate throughout its history.
But the other change in that emphasis on the spectrum is the emphasis, the recognition that let's disrupt the problem as early as possible. In other words, when I take that DSM test, as if I were still, the day before I got sober, right? If I take that DSM test for that Mary Beth, I still end up on the very severe end of the spectrum. But if we can disrupt it when it's at the more mild or moderate level, it's not that it's going to be easier, that you might not struggle with stopping, but it's going to be easier than if you wait until it's more severe, right? And so the sooner that you address it, the better off you are. And you're right. You don't have to wait until your entire life is destroyed to see that there are negative consequences. I mean, the definition of addiction is continued use despite negative consequences. Yeah. So let's do it when you've got like 3 negative consequences and not 12 negative consequences. Like that's a good time to try to get it under control,
Yes.
So we encourage that.
So kind of along that same vein, one of the things that I especially loved about your book was your approach to recovery being non-religious. And listen, don't come for me, internet. If you're into God and religion and that helped you get clean and sober, I love that for you. So I'm not here to yuck your yum. Personally, however, I am also not a religious person. And so someone else that I am close with, whose name I'm not going to drop because it's not my story to tell, but they also experienced a very similar thing. And I wanted to talk about that a lot because you were kind of out here doing the non-religious recovery thing before it was as known as it is.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I'll first caveat it with, 12 step, of course, has the higher power, which I'll say doesn't have to be God, but still, for a lot of us, turning our will and our life over, like that wasn't something I was going to do.
Yes.
But it's not as if all the faith-based people go to 12 steps and all the people without religion go to the other programs. There are atheists and agnostics that make 12 steps work, and there are a lot of religious and spiritual people in the other programs. Because, for example, they might prefer Life Ring because it's focused on building an individual plan for you. Or they might like She Recovers because that's not just for substance recovery, but it's also for mental health recovery and trauma recovery. Or they might like the meeting format of Women for Sobriety. I mean, there's a wide variety of options, and there are a wide variety of reasons why you might choose one over the other. And like you, I support 12 steps when it's the right fit. Where we run into problems is when people are falsely told that it's the only option or that it works better, because that is, neither one of those statements is true. It doesn't work better. It works equally well. The other groups work equally well. To me, it's only about what's going to work best for you, as an individual. And so I want people to know they have choice so they can find the right fit. If it's the right fit, they'll have a better chance of success, right? And for me, 12 steps definitely wasn't the right fit. I really, really from the beginning took control of my recovery. Like I viewed it as my job to listen, right? To listen to what worked for other people, what strategies or techniques work. I read all the 12. I read the AA Big Book. I read the NA Tax, but I also did other programs, Life Rings Parent, Smarts Parent, Women for Sobriety. But I was listening during the friggin' smoke break. Like, is somebody saying something I can use, right? But that was to listen, and so I could consider what I always viewed as suggestions or ideas, right? And I get to decide which of those ideas do I think will work best for me? Like, I'm the decision maker in my recovery plan. And I want a plan that's going to work for me as an individual. And you are right. A lot more people are interested in that approach today, that they get to decide. And a lot more people do what I do, which is mix and match programs. Like, you don't even have to pick one. You can do more than one. And then like us, I also did therapy, right? A lot of people do mindfulness. I mean, there's all kinds of combinations. But one of the reasons I did write the memoir is all the memoirs that I saw out there were 12-step memoirs. And so I wanted to have an example of somebody who did it a different way, who did it without faith, but also who did it with a more self-empowerment approach. That's how I viewed it. I was the boss. And I'll say my techniques work for 12-step people too, but I just wanted there to be an example out there of what it might look like to build an individual type recovery plan.
That's one of the things that I also loved is, me personally, and I think you are right, you nail it when, you talk about, for women, most likely shrinking ourselves and admitting, I'm powerless to my addiction can be counterintuitive to the recovery for a lot of people, especially women. And so, owning the fact that I can do this, I will do this, and taking charge of your own recovery in that sense. It's so important for, I think, a lot of people. And I know someone, for instance, that had tried, to go to the AA meetings and, got some stuff out of it, but really struggled with that sort of self-defeating mentality of being powerless, because they were already kind of struggling in that space of feeling unworthy, feeling like not enough, feeling like, ashamed that they were dealing with any type of an addiction. And so it just exacerbated those issues. And then they actually found rational recovery, and that helped them so much more because it made them feel much more empowered. And hey, if it works for you, it works for you. Fantastic. But I think that's, at the end of the day, the key point.
Well, and you're right. I mean, a lot of people, for example, don't like the defects focus of 12 steps. They find that undermines them, right? Instead of, like, for example, focusing on your strengths, or let's focus on building up your positives. Let's focus on building up your attributes. Let's focus on building up your power and your control and your confidence and your competence. And that is a different way of looking at it than focusing on defects. And the other part of it is, I mean, I know women who have been encouraged in 12 steps for a traumatic event to look at what was their part in it. And that can be very problematic. What was your part in the fact that your boyfriend beat you up, or that you got, sexually assaulted or whatever? And I'm not saying all 12-step sponsors would do that, but it definitely does happen to women. And that can be really problematic. So you're right. It's a lot of women, what they really need is to have themselves built up, to have their strengths noticed, their confidence increased. Like Women for Sobriety, they talk about the 4C woman: capable, caring, compassionate, and competent, right? That these are the attributes we should be focusing on.
Heck
And
yeah.
it does work a lot better for many people. But that's why it's good to test out different groups too, just to see where you feel most comfortable. If you're not, I mean, when I got sober in 93, 94, and I always emphasize there was like no Google. Okay. There was no
Yeah,
Google.
you mentioned that in here, which I'm so impressed. Like, how do you figure stuff out? That's hard.
I had to go to the library. I had to call 800 numbers and send checks to PO boxes. I mean, it was a whole thing, But today, the good news is you can Google all this stuff and find the options and read up on them. And plus, today, especially post COVID, they all have online meetings. I mean, 12 Steps has online meetings too. But for example, like LifeRing, which I'm on the board for, we have face-to-face meetings, but not in every town. But now, if you want to participate, you can always participate online. And so it just gives people so many more options and so much more choice that it's really a lot easier for people to find a group they're comfortable with, because they can find it online, even if they can't find it in their hometown.
Which, again, is really what it boils down to, is finding what works for you and going with that. And maybe what works for you is not going to be the same 3 years from now too.
Right.
And so
That's right.
being flexible about that, I think, is just, it's not talked about as often as I think it should be. I wanted to point out, without spoiling too much of your book or anything, I loved that at the end you have a section about recovery guidelines, and it's kind of, here's what worked for me, and therefore what I would suggest, try this. And so I love the while I do not believe any one strategy is right for everyone, I offer the following guidance intended to help you create the best plan for you. And you outlined it really well. I took notes, I highlighted, I think that's so fantastic. And what's key about that for me is, so often, you see these shows or these interviews or books or whatever, and they say, don't wait, get help, start today. But okay, but how? I think that sometimes is missing. It's a component that, yes, okay, I'm ready. What do I do? Google, how do I get, you genuinely don't know where to start, especially if you're in a situation where, you're not, you haven't lost your house, your job, you're, shooting up and very clearly, your body is deteriorating. It's, I think, easier to deny that you need help or know how to ask for help when you don't consider yourself a severe user. And so I love that you included that, because I think that that is just incredibly helpful, and it gives people a starting off point.
And I mean, my goal really was to make the book useful, right? Look, writing a book is hard work. It takes time. and the reason that I decided to do it was, when I read Recovery Memoir. Well, first of all, when I was appointed a judge, it was sort of like a time of reflection. Like, how did I go from shooting meth to this? But it was also, can my story be of use? And one of the things I noticed was that, you're right, a lot of memoirs at the end, it's sort of like, I went to a couple meetings and everything was great. And it's like, well, that's not how recovery works, So I wanted to be more realistic. And the guidelines I did include as just sort of like a roadmap to think about to get started. And I'll say, even people with severe addictions, just today, somebody messaged me through my website, which you can do, by the way, junkie2judge.com. And they were asking me, do I think they need to go to inpatient or IOP or intensive outpatient, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a complicated thing. But even with the level of fairly severe, it sounded like substance use disorder, to know what the treatment options are, or like when I give workshops and I'll lay out the treatment detox, inpatient, outpatient, working with a therapist with addiction expertise. People are often surprised that all they ever heard of was inpatient. And that's not, and 12 steps, right? Like, those are the only two things they know. And there are so many other choices today. And also, the reality is, not everybody needs to go inpatient. And even if it would benefit you, not everybody has access to inpatient treatment. treatment. If you don't have insurance and you don't have cash, it can be impossible to get inpatient. But some people can't do it. They can't leave their job, or they're a single mother, or whatever it might be.
Right.
And so for everyone, knowing options and knowing different approaches can be a bit of a challenge. And so anything that I can do with my book, or you, I'm sure with your podcast, you're making information available to people to help ease the road ahead for them.
Right. And for, loved ones as well. I
Yes.
do have an audience somewhat of people that have someone they care about that has either been in recovery or is just not, unfortunately. And I think it also helps reduce the stigma and helps people understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes to talk about this stuff. In my opinion, you can't have too many people talking about this.
Yeah.
Maybe what I'm saying is not wholly unique and the first time it's been said, but the more it gets said and the more it's out there, I think the better overall. So I have a question for you, actually. One of the things that I noted, because you did originally go to inpatient, I believe.
Yes.
And so 2 months later, after you made the decision, because doc was like, hey, we're done, stop this. And so you were like, okay, but what if I go to rehab? And so then the next chapter, 2 months later, and then you had to get on a waiting list once you found a place. And it looks like it then took another 3 months for you to get in. So that's 5 months of time for you to potentially get cold feet. What kept you motivated to not, convince yourself that you didn't need it or to not do it or whatever?
I mean, I will say this is still unfortunately very true today. A lot of people have to get on wait lists, or it can take a long time. And so, yeah, well, first of all, doc was definitely a factor. My partner was ready to throw me out, but there were other reasons for me to finally look at rehab. I mean, I was having physical problems. I was really just miserable and trapped, couldn't hold a job. I mean, I was in a really bad place and had been for a long time. But at first I had to find a place that could take me. I had no insurance, and I really didn't have money. Now, I was lucky in that I was in California, where substance treatment actually counts as disability. And, like you can get short-term disability if you go into substance treatment, if you were working and paid in, you know what I mean? Like if you had a job and paid in. So that was to my advantage, but it wasn't a lot of money. And so it took me a while to find a program I could actually afford to go that would take me. And then I was on a wait list, and I had to call every Monday to keep my name from dropping to the bottom of the list again.
Wow. And so you even mentioned this, as somebody that your main priority is like getting high and staying high. That's, outside of that, you're probably not staying up on top of a lot of things. So to continue to stay on top of calling, and man, what Herculean effort.
I know.
And the way it's portrayed, like in the movies, and a lot of times it's this sort of last ditch panic. Fine. Okay, I'll go. And then they take you from right there to the treatment center before you can, back out and change your mind and panic. Versus not only did you have to go on a waiting list, do the research to find a place, but then continue to follow up. So, it just makes you wonder how many people just, give up for any number of reasons.
Well, I mean, think about it. I had some advantages. I was living in a stable house. I mean, what if you're, unhoused, or you're getting kicked out from here to there, or you're couch surfing, right? It makes it even harder. I mean, this is part of what drives me crazy with the policy discussions about what our drug policy should be, is that there's often this underlying assumption that everybody who wants treatment can get it. And it's just not true.
It's not easy.
And we need to face that reality. And we do lose people. People die waiting to get treatment, and people, they move 5 times or whatever it might be, and they can't follow through. And just being on drugs makes everything hard to follow through.
Just a minor detail.
A minor detail. But I'll also say it's not, you asked what kept me motivated. It was never that I was 100% committed to sobriety, or that I was 100% sure I could get sober, because I didn't actually believe it was possible for me to get sober. And I say that because I don't want people to feel they have to have that level of certainty before they start the process. I think ambivalence and uncertainty is normal. I mean, most of us enter recovery that way, and we'll go back and forth. I also did not have perfect sobriety from day one, which most people don't. You know, I used 3 times in my first 5 months, and I like to say that 3 times, and then I started the clock on my current 30 years, right? And so, and I do also emphasize that think of how much better 3 times in 5 months was, you know, but yet in some recovery circles, that would be counted as you failed, like 3 failures and then success, which I think is the wrong way to look at it. I used 3 times in 5 months. I have been using every day for many years. And as I like to point out, what an improvement. And if I could have used 3 times in 5 months on a regular basis, I would have been in friggin' rehab. You know what I'm saying? Like It was a lot better, right? So to me, that was part of the process of getting enough skills and enough sort of hope that actually other people were doing it, so maybe I could too. Like I was learning that in my early couple months, and just sort of the practice, right? And so it was just part of the process to get what I needed in order to start my sobriety clock ticking. But yeah, I wasn't sure. I wasn't, it was just that I knew I was miserable and I knew that my life was destroyed. And Doc was ready to throw me out, and I did not want to deal with that. That was a consequence that would have created even more chaos in my life on top of the pain of losing the relationship. So I was motivated, but I wasn't convinced that, you know, that sobriety was going to be at the end of the tunnel. I really was hoping just to figure out how to use less, like so that my life wouldn't be better, you know, like it was the best I could imagine was maybe I can figure out how to use less. Like that was in my mind the best case scenario.
And honestly, that's still better. That is still better, you know? And like, God, I feel that so much, because even when I quit drinking, and I'm one of those people, and you know, this is not to pass judgment on those who can't, whatever. I'm one of those people that I am able to occasionally have a drink still without falling back into that trap. But I have to be very careful and cognizant about my relationship with alcohol. Why am I drinking? How much have I had to drink? How often am I, you know, it's just a new scope. And, you know, in 2020, I like just every day, I couldn't imagine not having it, because it was a security blanket, but it also made me miserable. I can't tell you how often I was hungover. I gained like 70 pounds, and I felt, and so that's not to like body shame or anything either. I still looked great, but I was carrying the physical representation of my grief and my pain on the outside of my body, and it didn't feel like mine anymore. It looked different, and it had changed, not because I was out, you know, enjoying life and having, you know, decadent pasta dinners and things. It was because I was poisoning myself every day. And to imagine like I'm going to quit and I'm going to become super healthy and everything's going to change, like absolutely not. I just wanted to maybe not be so miserable, you know?
Yes. And for me, it was really that, it was a pain management tool. Like I always knew that the violence was underneath my drug use. And so for me, what I remember going to rehab in fear, terror almost, because I didn't know what was going to happen. If the drugs were removed, all I could imagine was that I was going to have some kind of a psychotic break, or, you know, I would end up committing suicide, or the pain was going to overwhelm me. So it was partly that I had no understanding of other pain management techniques, you know, and so I was really afraid of taking the substances away because I knew that I was using them to numb out, and I knew I was using them to stuff things down. So what am I going to do? I remember when doctors started me to rehab, and I was going, I don't remember deciding to agreeing to do this, you know, because I was so like suddenly in fear. And that is what a lot of it is for us. We don't know how, and I'll say that's also something that's changed in my 30 years. When I got sober, they told us that they wouldn't even evaluate us for other mental health conditions until we had like 90 days sober. And that is the wrong answer. And today we do understand that, a very high percentage of people with an addiction have another mental health condition at the same time. It's 55 to 75%, depending on the data. I mean, I had PTSD and I didn't know it. I had very severe anxiety. And so now we understand that you need to address both from the beginning, from the beginning. If anybody going in for substance treatment should be on day one or pre-admission evaluated for other mental health conditions too, because your odds of success are going to be better if they're both tackled from the beginning.
And tackled individually as well, I wanted to point out, because, they are connected conditions, but they are separate conditions.
They are, but you don't want to wait, because that can create more chaos, right? And so, and I did understand that I needed trauma treatment. I called it abuse history at the time. I needed, help with my abuse history. So when I got home from rehab, I didn't listen to them. I got a therapist with expertise in trauma, and I really needed that. And also, and it wasn't just to stay sober. It wasn't that I thought I can't stay sober without this, although probably I couldn't have. It was that I knew I can't be happy if I don't address this. If I don't address this, I'm never going to be happy. Like, that was really what was underneath it. And so I had to tackle both. And like for most of us, I think it took a lot longer to get my PTSD and my anxiety under reasonable control than my substance use. And that I think is common, because the other mental health conditions often came first, and they're usually more complicated. And so they are, like you say, they're related, but somewhat separate processes. And definitely the recovery period can be on a different track for substance use compared to other things.
And those things don't just simply go away. Like that one doctor you talked about that was like, we are clearly depressed because this bad stuff happened to you. So just keep taking these meds. And once you're less depressed, you're not going to want to do drugs anymore. And like, that is not how that works. And, for a lot of people too, when you take the substance away, you don't have another coping mechanism. And so the mental health stuff really comes, barging through the door. So, it's important that both are being treated, because that's tough. What, in your early recovery, when we, left the meth behind, what became some of your early positive coping mechanisms?
I did start to build some relationships, in recovery, like some supportive relationships. I mean, I had friends when I'm using, but there's the drugs are sort of in between the love, right? I mean, it's hard. I had some loving relationships, like my best friend Gina, but still, you can't. When I was using, I couldn't be there for my friends. You know what I mean? Like, I couldn't show up when they needed me. I was very unreliable. And so in recovery, I did start to build some strong relationships. In fact, just 2 days ago, I went out with my girlfriend from rehab, from 1993. And so I still have this. So that was helpful, to try to, bond, especially with other women. I did really focus more on women's meetings and try to develop those friendships to be where I could actually start to be there for them, and then they could be there for me. And then Doc and I did couples counseling. We needed to stabilize that relationship, and that was important. But also, a lot of it was that I really forced myself to notice the positive changes I was making. Like for me, because of the anxiety, I was always like a negative thinker. I still tend to think for the negative, but at that time I could really catastrophize, and all I could see was what I could have, should have, would have had if I would have been using drugs for 20 years or any little mistake. And so one of the important things for me in early recovery was to actually force myself to stop intermittently and look and say, well, actually, look, you've made some progress in the first 60 days or 90 days or 6 months, and to make myself see it. Because once I could see it, it helped me start to build up my confidence, that actually I was on the right path, that I was mostly making good decisions, but also I could see that I wasn't tapped out on progress. Like I was still moving forward. There was still more forward momentum, which made me feel more hopeful about the future. So that was really important to my recovery, including because it was not my natural tendency at all.
Well, and you also mentioned in your book too, you journaled a lot, which I think can be very helpful in, being able to revisit where you were maybe 2 months ago or a week ago. But also there is just something so So helpful to actually put pen to paper or type, whatever you prefer, and try to illustrate your own thoughts to the, invisible audience of the page. I find, having journaled off and on my whole life and writing and things like that, that there's just something very unique about that process.
Yeah, I mean, especially because it can help in a way slow my thinking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my brain spins fast. I'm a fast typist, but my brain spins even faster. And so when you're writing it, and a lot of people prefer handwriting when they do journaling for that reason, it can slow down the thoughts and help you focus, and sometimes we're really surprised about what we write when we journal. And so that can be interesting to see what did I actually type here. I didn't realize it at this level of clarity or these connections, because I would just spin and spin and spin in emotion. But slowing it down to actually write something could help me sort of tell myself things that I wasn't as consciously aware of as I really could benefit from being.
How was the process of writing the book for you? Was it, were there moments that it was kind of triggering, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so when I started the book, it was about, I mean, I did therapy, individual therapy, and then group therapy with women with trauma histories. I was in therapy for like my first 9 years of sobriety. But by the time I was writing the book, that was like 10 years ago. And so there was sort of a gap in me thinking deeply. I mean, I would, sometimes think of these things or talk about them if it came up, in conversation or was relevant to something happening in the news or whatever, but I hadn't focused on it. And so the book was a new sort of wave of revisiting things that had happened and looking at them with fresh eyes again. And some of it was challenging because, to write a memoir, you have to immerse yourself in the scene and in the emotion. But on the other hand, there were parts of that process that actually helped me release some of the sort of the self-judgment and self-criticism that I was still hanging on to. Like there was one event in this rape that you probably will know what I'm talking about, where I made a decision that I second guessed myself for 20 years afterward. Did I make the right choice? What was I not prioritizing my own safety, or, what did it mean? And when I wrote those scenes for the book, it became very clear to me that there actually wasn't any other choice, that I did the only thing that realistically could have been done. And so it helped me release that sort of lingering self-judgment.
That's interesting, because it's like similar to journaling, but on such a very deep level. And I do know what you're talking about, and I do agree. I remember reading that and just, I think I was on a plane when I read that scene. And so just jaw dropping, kind of like, what would I do? How do you experience that and even think clear headed enough? I mean, like, again, I don't want to spoil anything. Cause I loved reading this. I think if you're watching this, go read it. But even my sister was with me and like nudged me like, are you okay? What are you reading? So I had to show her this is what it was. I was telling my husband earlier today, I've been so excited about meeting you because it's just, I mean, I'm a book lover anyway. I love authors anyway, but I've also, come to really love this line of work and being in recovery, because I think it's just so helpful. And like something I say on the show all the time, you can't get help if you're dead. So, that's why I personally am an advocate for conversations and, just the frankness of all of it.
Well, I will say the one comment you just made there about the, we can't help, if they're dead, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to also talk about in the book was my use of the needle exchange, during the last couple of years that I was shooting drugs, right? Because,
Yes.
Harm reduction, which I'm sure your viewers know, it's just, there's a lot of different aspects to it, but the basic idea is meet people where they are and start the sort of the positive process. But there's a lot of negative publicity around things like syringe services programs. And for me, I think it was 3 or 4 years that I was shooting meth, because of HIV. San Francisco had an unofficial needle exchange. It wasn't legal, but the van would pull up twice a week in one location on, I don't know, Tuesday and one on Friday, I think it was. And we would line up for to give our dirty needles and get clean needles. And the cops would just drive by like it was tolerated because they were trying to quench HIV transmission. And that was really helpful to me. I mean, when I got sober, I did not have HIV. I did not have Hep C. I didn't have any bloodborne disease. And part of that was because of the needle exchange. So I wanted to own it up, but also to help put an example out there of why. But the other part of the data side of it is that the data shows that people who participate in syringe service programs are 3 to 5 times as likely to enter treatment. And so that is also a positive because you're building a relationship with the service provider, right? And today they're all, except like legal in San Francisco, syringe services, there's a building, like there's not just a van, there's actual
a word of mouth van, like, it's
right,
totally fine.
Right. But I know a lot of people, it can be counterintuitive to think that it's a good idea, to give out needles. But the reality is the people who are getting needles are not first-time drug users or people that are casual. There are people that are shooting drugs. They're already, shooting drugs. But it's also an opportunity. Most syringe services sites have things like information about treatment options. They'll do testing for HIV or STDs. They'll offer, medical resources. They'll usually have a social worker. So it's usually some type of wraparound type services where people have access to things. Some of them have laundry facilities, things that people need. But even just on the if our goal is to get people into treatment side of it, you do get more people into treatment by having those kind of services available. And so I always like to point those kind of things out because I know if you're not in sort of our world, it can be hard to understand why giving people clean needles is a good idea.
Right. Well, and I even have some relatives that have asked me because of my line of work and experience and conversations with people, well, doesn't that just encourage the behavior? Or, I would just keep using, because we did a show last year about Narcan when Narcan became available in stores and everything. And I have some. I've never used an opiate, and unless you consider kratom, that was a whole other situation. But I have never used them, and I carry it on me all the time. And I talk about that. And, one of my relatives was asking, well, doesn't that encourage them to just keep using because they know, oh yeah, I'll just, I'll Narcan myself. And it's so much more complicated than that when it comes to harm reduction. And so I would love to hear your thoughts kind of on that argument. I know it's a touchy subject, so sorry to just throw you to the wolves, but
no. I mean, first of all, you can't Narcan yourself, okay? Because you're out. Okay, you have to. So
right.
One harm reduction technique, by the way, is don't use alone. Okay, like this is really important. And I'll say I even think in harm reduction, like with parents talking to kids, like I think it's important for parents to share the true risks of drugs with their kids. Let them have accurate, not exaggerated, but actually accurate information, but also harm reduction techniques. Like honestly, if you're a teen or 20 something listening and you're doing drugs anyway, especially if you're doing pills or opiates, why do you all have to take the pill at the same time? Let one person do it, have a Narcan sitting there, wait a half an hour and just make sure everything's okay. Like and I'm just saying.
Please test your drugs. Please test them. It is
test,
so easy to test.
But the problem with testing is it doesn't tell you how much, right? It'll tell you if fentanyl is in it, which is important, especially if you think you're buying Oxy or you think you're buying Percocet or something else, right? But the reality is a lot of those pills do have fentanyl in them. But if it's if you're buying, heroin, I mean, like in the West Coast, there is no such thing as pure heroin anymore. It doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's all fentanyl. It's either partly or completely fentanyl, right? And so the testing doesn't tell you how much, and how much is really your higher risk factor. But yeah, Narcan being readily available is important. I have Narcan in my car. I have Narcan in my house. We don't do drugs. And I will tell you, there was a woman in the town next door to me. There was a 17-year-old boy overdosing in the park, and the woman had Narcan in her car, and she saved his life. And that's so, amazing. It's Narcan is easy to use. It's just a spray up the nose. It kicks the opiate off the opiate receptor. The person will revive. But not only that, if they're not actually having an overdose, it doesn't hurt them. So you can't hurt them. You can only help them. Is Narcan the ultimate solution? No, but it does keep people alive. And it is, for the last 3 years, we've had, over 100,000 deaths from opiates. The vast 80% are opiates. 80% of the deaths are opiates, most of which is fentanyl. And last year went down slightly. Probably part of the reason it went down at all is because of the more readily available access to Narcan. And so we're trying to save people till they get help. The way I look at harm reduction is it's two prongs to me. One is having helping people, like having people that care about you and that are offering you assistance, that actually does increase the likelihood that you're going to get treatment, and or that you'll stay alive long enough to get treatment. But even if you never get treatment, I don't want you to die a miserable death, because you use drugs, because you have the mental health condition of substance use disorder. I don't want that to be a fatal condition. Yes. There are some negatives from too much Narcan, like, it can start to impact the brain. We need to pay attention. People need to be evaluated if they've been Narcan, multiple times. So it's complicated. But the other thing I'll say is I really encourage parents who have teenagers or 20-somethings living in the home. I think Narcan should be part of your first aid kit. You don't know, even if you don't think your kid is doing drugs, the reality is that the overdose numbers, one of the reasons that they're higher is because more casual users are dying than before. So it used to be that almost everybody who died of an overdose was a long-term heroin user predominantly. That was like almost all of the deaths. And that's still 2/3 of the deaths. But 1/3 of the deaths today are casual users because they don't know fentanyl's in what they're taking, or they don't understand the amount. And so you may think my child, my teenager, my 20-something isn't using, but it could be the 3rd time that they ever use, or they could be a casual user. You're not going to see the signs necessarily if they're using once or twice a month, right? They're not going to have their behavior change or do all the things you're used to looking for, but they still could die. And so for me, I really encourage, especially the parents of teens and 20-somethings, to have Narcan in the house.
I love that. And going back to what you were saying, I cannot emphasize enough how much I agree that, even if you don't go to rehab and don't get help, I don't want you to die a terrible death. I don't want that on you. And I think that's what it really comes down to, is an understanding of the compassion and empathy, and not looking at someone, as a junkie equals garbage. Like, you just don't, you don't deserve to exist, that you are somehow morally bankrupt, when we have, and I think you even mentioned this early on in your book, and even earlier today, talking about, lots of people drink alcohol and they're not looked down on in the same way as somebody that, maybe they tried this or that and, used harder drugs and got hooked. And now they're looked down on as, well, they're just junkies, or they're just this. Like, how demoralizing and dehumanizing. And that, I find that very, I usually don't argue on the internet, but every once in a while, man, I just see some really crappy comment about, well, if they really wanted help, they'd get help. Like, God, can you just have a little more compassion and empathy, please?
Well, I think there's also a mixing up of a problem of having so many unhoused people, and the problem of substance use disorder, right? And people, it seems like a lot of the vitriol is about the public use of drugs, and that's really related to unavailable housing, right? Like, I live in the Bay Area. Cost of housing here is astronomical. The reason we have as many people using drugs in public is because they don't have a home to go to, because we have a housing problem. And so those two things can get conflated, and that, and that can create, look, I understand how frustrating it must be if you're living in a community where there are a lot of unhoused people doing drugs on the street, but the focus there to me needs, you got to be on housing. And the other thing is, again, there isn't treatment on demand. San Francisco, actually, there was a proposition passed, I think 5 years ago, to get treatment on demand, and we still don't have it.
Oh, gosh.
And so, to me, this also ties to the whole incarceration thing, right? Do people understand that when we incarcerate someone for drug use, first of all, we're incarcerating most of those people for a medical condition that the government admits is a disease or a mental health disorder, and yet we're throwing them in jail for it. That's a problem. But even if you only care about how your tax dollars are spent, you could treat 3 or 4 people for the price of incarcerating one. And so, let's look at where we're spending our resources. And if you want treatment on demand, to me, how you get that is you start treating more people and incarcerating fewer.
I mean, preach, honestly. I could soapbox on this so much because it ties into the topic of, something I discuss with my friends a lot is you want suicide prevention, don't post a hotline, post, resources for people, make housing more affordable, make things more, stable for people. That's really the treatment. The suicide prevention and crime prevention is making better resources available to those who need them.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that the US has one of the highest addiction rates in the world, right? And there are reasons for that. And sometimes people ask me, what's the number one thing we could do to reduce the addiction rate in America? And my response is mental health treatment for children. Because if you get them early when they're having problems, when they're having trauma, or they have untreated depression or untreated anxiety or untreated ADHD or whatever it might be, that if we spent the money there, their odds of developing a substance use disorder later would be much, much lower.
Well, and I could imagine, if at that early of an age, especially, let's look at your story, coming from the chaotic environment that you were in and feeling invisible, unnoticed, and also not having anyone to model for you what those positive outlets might look like or how coping mechanisms even.
Yes.
And so if young children are getting that mental health treatment, they're also learning positive coping mechanisms. So in those moments of overwhelm, they're not turning to a substance necessarily. They also have other tools in that toolbox.
Yes, they know how to emotionally regulate. They know how to reach out for help if they need it. There are all other kind of positives, yes, that will ripple through.
Man, I could soapbox on this all day. Well, listen, I have loved chatting with you. This has been such a delight, and it is such an odd experience to really feel like you get to know someone through reading their words and their history and their story, and then to sit down with them face to face. It's just, that's so neat. It's like, oh my God, are we best friends now? Oh, this is so great. So is there anything that we haven't touched on that you do want to touch on or that you do want to discuss before we kind of close out?
Well, I just want to sort of mention contact information for people. So, for example, a lot of the policy issues that we've discussed, I on my Twitter, my X/Twitter feed, I actually don't argue with people very often. I don't have time, but I do post the new studies that come out. I post articles, including about the topics that we've been talking about today, and I post my recovery thoughts as well. And I'm at MaryBethO_. And then my website, junkie2judge.com, some of my opinion pieces, like I've had pieces in the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, those are there. Some other example podcasts, but people can message me through my website. Like if they have I do a lot of speaking workshops, I do keynotes, I do training for lawyers and judges, and you can message me through that website. And then my book, of course, is on Amazon and all the usual sites, from Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And as we talked about, I really did try to make that book be useful. Like that really was a primary goal. And so hopefully that, it seems like they had their result with you and you see it that way. So I'm really, it really warms my heart to know that, because that really was the primary purpose.
That honestly, it hit for me. So I loved it. And I'm very big on authenticity. And so if I didn't like it, I would have, I don't know how I would have honestly handled this interview. That's a different Jessica problem. But no, I genuinely loved it. I really did. And I've been talking to like my book friends about, you need to read this book. Because I've read other memoirs about addiction and recovery. And this one, I think I loved first of all, the fact that it was a woman who was also not allowing her addiction to make her shrink herself. And I think you just see that so infrequently. And there were a lot of parallels that I could really relate to in this story as well. So in any case, thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, it's been fun for me too. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I love your personality, but also the depth of the discussion. So thank you so much.
I try. I'm a little rusty, so it's been a couple of months. It's just been nuts. Anyway, what do I always say at the end? It's been so long. I guess we, like, follow, subscribe, and all of those good things. Does anyone say that anymore? I don't know. I'm not cool. So if you enjoyed this podcast, tell all your friends and leave comments, because that helps us know what you guys like and what you don't like, and makes the algorithm monsters happy. And so it pushes it out to other people. Because at the end of the day, my goal here is to just help people. I just like people. I know Mary Beth feels the same, and anybody who comes on the show I know feels the same. So give us your thoughts and share this. And lights of recovery. Jess. Thanks, you guys. Mwah.